Today we're going to finally meet the monster Grendel face to face, person to person. This lovely depiction of Grendel here on my slideshow. Very nice creature, Grendel is. There's his little purse where he fills the bag with heads and arms to take back to his lair to, have a nice little barbecue. This section of Beowulf is particularly important because it's a major part of the cycle. So far we've gotten to the hero being charged with a quest, and the hero taking the call to adventure, and Beowulf's on his way to the castle. And when we left off, Beowulf had just reached Hrothgar's mead hall, Harrod Hall. And in this section, Beowulf's going to encounter a test, a challenge. And this is a part of Joseph Campbell's cycle where the hero must overcome these obstacles along the way that lead them to greatness and to that final reward resurrection moment. And Grendel is a particularly interesting figure because if you've noticed in the text, there have been these allusions to something called the Mark of Cain. And in the web quest, there was a question about the Mark of Cain and what does it symbolize and who are Cain and Abel. And just like a lot of Western literature, there's Christianity and Judaism and Islam somewhere in there. And Cain and Abel, who Grendel is a descendant of, and Grendel's mother, who we'll meet in the next section, Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve, the first humans from the book of Genesis. And one day Cain is really jealous of his brother Abel because, Abel's a good farmer and God keeps saying, "You go, boy, you're doing a good job." So Cain decides to, be a rational human being, and he decides to murder his brother in cold blood in the field, thinking that no one will ever know. God comes down from heaven and says, "Cain, where's your brother Abel?" And Cain's, doing the typical, student who didn't do his homework excuse. I don't know where it is. Schoology wasn't working. I don't know. So God's like, yeah, actually, you're lying. I know that you killed your brother, so you're banished, and your children and all your descendants will suffer for all time. So of course Cain starts to freak out because just like his parents, like mother and father and son, he says, "Oh, but God, what shall I do? People are going to try to murder me, and they'll be so angry with me." So God puts this mark on Cain that's kind of a protection. And God says, "Okay, Cain, if anyone tries to murder you in cold blood or tries to murder you in general, they will suffer a gazillion times over. They'll suffer a really bad fate. Because to murder someone is not the solution, right? So and it's an anti-revenge tale. So this mark is also on Grendel. So this presents an interesting problem to Beowulf that he has to solve, where how can you kill the monster without suffering yourself? So how is Beowulf going to kill Grendel if Grendel's protected by this mark of Cain? And the storyteller, anonymous, because we don't know who wrote it, presents a really interesting way around this. Some of you might find it funny. Some of you might find it ridiculous. But just like the Avengers movies and other heroes' journey cycles, sometimes these things just happen because God wills it or because there's a magic power involved. So you just kind of have to roll with it, right? This is fantasy. So let's meet Grendel, and let's now start reading the Battle of Harrod Hall, Beowulf versus Grendel. Beowulf, Part 4, Fight with Grendel. Then out of the night came the Shadow Stalker. Stealthy and swift, the hall guards were slack asleep at their posts, all except one. It was widely understood that as long as God disallowed it, the fiend could not bear them to his shadow-born. One man, however, was in a fighting mood, awake and on edge, spoiling for action. In the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily lopping, The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. And under the cloud murk he moved toward it, until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. Nor was that the first time he had scouted the grounds of Hrothgar's dwelling. Although never in his life before or since did he find harder fortune for hall defenders. Spurned and joyless, he journeyed on ahead and arrived at the bawn. The iron braced door turned on its hinge when his hands touched it, and then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread, while a baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion, sleeping, a ranked company of kinsmen and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic. Picturing the mayhem. Before morning, he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh. But his fate that night was due to change. His days of ravening had come to an end. Mighty and canny, Hygelac's kinsman, also known as Beowulf, was keenly watching for the first move the monster would make. Nor did the creature keep him waiting, but struck suddenly and started in. He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit in his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving the body utterly lifeless, eaten up, hand and foot. Venturing closer, his talon was raised to attack Beowulf where he lay on the bed. He was bearing in with open claw when the alert hero's comeback and armlock forestalled him utterly. The captain of evil discovered himself in a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the earth. Each bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never clamped or cornered like this. Then Hygelac's trusty retainer recalled his bedtime speech, sprang to his feet, and got a firm hold. Fingers were bursting, the monsters backtracking, the man overpowering. The dread of the land was desperate to escape, to take a roundabout road and flee to his lair in the fens. But the latching power in his fingers weakened. It was the worst trip the terror monger had taken to Herod, and now the timbers trembled and sang. A hall session that harrowed every Dane inside the stockade, stumbling in fury. The two contenders crashed through the building. The hall clattered and hammered, but somehow survived the onslaught and kept standing. It was handsomely structured, a sturdy frame braced with the best of blacksmith's work inside and out. The story goes that as the pair struggled, mead benches were smashed and sprung off the floor, gold fittings and all. And before then, no shielding elder would believe there was any power of person upon earth capable of wrecking their horn-rigged hall, unless the burning embrace of a fire engulfed it in flame. And then an extraordinary wall arose, and bewildering fear came over the Danes. Everyone felt it, who heard that cry as it echoed off the wall, a God-cursed scream and strain of catastrophe, the howl of loss, the lament of the hell serf keening his wound. He was overwhelmed, manacled tight by the man who of all men was foremost and strongest in the days of this life. But the Earl Troop's leader was not inclined to allow his caller to depart. He did not consider that life of much account to anyone anywhere. Time and again, Beowulf's warriors worked to defend their lord's life, laying about them as best they could with their ancestral blades. Stalwart in action, they kept striking out on every side, seeking to cut straight to the soul. And when they joined the struggle, there was something they could not have known at the time, that no blade on earth, no blacksmith's art could ever damage their demon opponent, the Mark of Cain. He had conjured the harm from the cutting edge of every weapon, but his going away out of this world and the days of his life would be agony to him, and his alien spirit would travel far into fiend's keeping. Then he, who had harrowed the hearts of men with pain and affliction in former times, had given offense also to God, found that his bodily powers failed him. Hygelac's kinsman kept him helplessly locked in a hand grip. As long as either lived, he was hateful to the other. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulder. Sinews split and the bone lappings burst, and Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. And Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. His days were numbered. To the end of his life was coming over him. He knew it for certain, and one bloody clash had fulfilled the dearest wish of the Danes. After the battle, the Danes rejoice, the proof of a victory as they followed the trail of blood of Grendel's swamp where he died in the murky waters. The people rejoiced throughout Denmark, and many raced back and forth, telling of the mighty deeds of Beowulf, often comparing him to Sigmund the dragon slayer. And Hrothgar returned to the hall and adopted Beowulf symbolically as a son. He praised the mighty hero and blessings of God, and Hrothgar finishes his speech by saying, quote, "But you have made yourself immortal by your glorious action. May the God of ages continue to keep and requite you well." And Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, spoke, "We have gone through with a glorious endeavor, and have been favored in this fight we did against the unknown. Nevertheless, if you could have seen the monster himself where he lay beaten, I would have been better pleased. My plan was to pounce and pin him down in a tight grip and grapple him to death. Have him panting for life, powerless and clasped in my bare hands, his body in thrall. But I couldn't stop him from slipping my hold. The Lord allowed it. My lock on him wasn't strong enough. He struggled fiercely and broke and ran. Yet he bought his freedom at a high price, for he left his hand and arm and shoulder to show he had been here, a cold comfort for having come among us. And now he won't be long for this world. He has done his worst, but the wound will end him. He is hasped and hooped and hurpling with pain, limping and looped in it like a man outlawed for wickedness. He must await the mighty judgment of God in majesty," said Beowulf. And there was less tampering and big talk then, from Unferth the boaster. Less of his blather, as the hall thanes eyed the awful proof of the hero's prowess, the splayed hand up under the eaves. Hrothgar then ordered the hall to be restored to its former glory, and soon a victory feast began. Beowulf and his men were awarded gold, jewels, swords, and armor for their reward. And then a minstrel sings of the tale of Hildebra, a Danish princess who was married off to an ally of her enemies as part of a truce. In this story, the Danes are in exile after a stalemate battle with the Jutes and Frisians, but they thirst for vengeance. And after a year, they attack and kill the king and bring his widow Hildbrith back home to Denmark. The story foreshadows the feud between the Geats and the Swedes in times to come. And that's the end of part 4 of Beowulf. So as you can see, in this section, Beowulf managed to find a way to kill Grendel, or should I say, Grendel managed to find a way to kill himself. Because when they had themselves locked in a tight grip, if you go back to that section and you read those lines again, it's on page 10, around line 770 to 790. There's a part where Grendel's shoulder starts to detach itself because Beowulf is so strong that Grendel rips his own arm off and then retreats and dies in his swamp. So Beowulf technically didn't kill Grendel. Grendel killed himself, which is why Beowulf is able to get around this whole "if you kill a descendant of Cain, something bad will happen to you" thing. Because God allowed Beowulf to keep Grendel's arm. And that, my friends, is the end of part 4. In the next section, we are going to meet Grendel's mother, who in the film version of Beowulf is played by Angelina Jolie. Watch it if you want to, but it's not that great. But enjoy.